So today I'm going to talk about the role of randomness in creating generative music in ZOIA programming. And also talk about the ways in which we can tame randomness, largely through probability. That is saying, how often does a random outcome result in an event, right? This is the heart of probability in ZOIA. So you can have random things occur, and sometimes those random things result in a change in the patch, and sometimes they don't, depending on what the random outcome is. Now, I'll begin with a caveat, as I often do, that generative music is a very large category. There are a lot of types of generative music, many of which do not involve much randomness. They can involve logical systems or ways of being recursive upon a motif. So when I say generative music here, I'm talking about a specific category of generative music that is sometimes called organic generative music, where there are, random notions of growth, or I learned it as aleatoric music, which is from the Greek word for wind and referred to wind chimes, I think, originally. And the idea that the wind would come and go, and sometimes different notes would play on a wind chime, and sometimes others would not. So when I talk about generative music here, I'm talking specifically about generative music that uses random numbers. And that's what the random module inside ZOIA generates. And this is going to be our sort of workhorse for this sort of thing. And so I thought I'd just patch up a random module to, this is a square wave oscillator, and down at the bottom, just so I don't have to refer to this again, I've got basically an on-off switch for my patch. I have a VCA, which is controlled by a push button, and it goes out to both sides of a stereo audio output. I'm not planning on using any stereo elements today, but you can certainly use randomness in stereo elements. This is just so I can hear from both of my monitors. So that's a random module patched directly into an oscillator. And one of the things that might stand out there is that, boy, this sounds an awful lot like noise. And that's because essentially what the random module is a digital noise source. It's a CV noise source. So you have the white noise for audio noise, or the noise module, which produces white noise. And this is also white noise. And white noise is interesting because it occupies the whole spectrum. And if we look at this, we see the dispersion of random elements occupying the whole spectrum. Now, when we want to use a random module in our patches, there are plenty of uses for this. I like it particularly as a modulation source. It can add noise as modulation, which can be something that gives an otherwise sterile patch a sense of organic distortion. But in most cases where I'm talking about generative music, what I'm going to do is connect it to a trigger source. And this is one of the options in our random module. We can go down and have it produce a new value on trigger. So every time a new rising CV is detected, that's what a trigger means in this context, it will produce a different output. And you can use all sorts of sources for triggers. You can use sequencers, you can use onset detectors and MIDI clock and all of that. For the purposes of our patching today, I am going to focus specifically on a square wave LFO, which is a very traditional clock source, because it's simple and straightforward. And I'm going to throw in a couple of specific elements that we'll come back to. I'm going to turn on the swing control, and if you've watched any of my other videos about LFOs, or if you have explored the swing control in the square wave LFO specifically, you know that the swing control acts as a duty cycle. So it controls how much of the square wave is on and how much is off, and we can change the ratio, the distribution per cycle of that. So we're going to put the swing control on, and I'm going to start out. I'm using firmware 1.13, so I have access to a linear CV control, and I'm going to use that because it may be, I'm foreshadowing here, because it allows me to control the rate of this LFO in a very predictable manner. And that means that I can manipulate its rate in productive ways. So the other thing that I'm going to do, just to get it out of the way, is that I'm sure some of you are going, well, why aren't you using the random LFO, right? It seems simpler than this setup, and I'll tell you why, but I also want to put one in place for a demonstration purpose. And I'm going to select the random waveform and set it to tap so that it can use this LFO as its clock source too. So if I want to change the rate of either one of these, I can do that. And so I'll do a demonstration. First of all, here's what our oscillator sounds like now. Which I'm not going to play a lot of because the full range of notes is, particularly as you get up into dog whistle stuff, you know, and bat hearing and all of that, not terribly pleasant. So I'm going to attenuate this for now. We're going to talk a little bit more about attenuation. And when I attenuate the signal, I'm basically limiting the range of notes or frequencies that can be produced by the random module. Here I'm setting it to about 50%, which means it will produce notes from A0 to A5 approximately, which is a pretty good range. It doesn't get too shrill. Right? And we're getting our random oscillator sound. You know, you may recognize this from classic sci-fi movies where, you know, the robot would be given, you know, random notes or ring modulation or what have you. I'm going to disconnect the random module, and I'm going to connect the random LFO at the same rate, at the same attenuation. What did I have that at? 49 point. Okay. Now I can hear the difference because I'm prepared to hear the difference. But what I'm going to do is show you why I prefer the random module to the random LFO. We can look at maybe it's easier to look at the value output. If you notice, the value output of the random LFO is very centered, right? It moves around 0.5, but it rarely ever goes to the extremes. We could watch this for quite a while And you would find that it occupies a much more narrow band of random values than our random module. If we look at its output, and I'll switch back to looking, we see it goes all over the place, right? We get values that are 0.99 and 0.01 and everything in between. And so I'm not going to say don't use the random LFO. And there may be places where you want the random values clustered around some center point. But I will say that when you do, you should be aware that it does not produce an even distribution of random values. And particularly at the extremes, it rarely seems to go far from this mid-range. So I'm going to play the random LFO again, and then I'll play the random module, and now that you know what you're listening for, see if you can hear it too. So that's the random LFO. I'm going to disconnect it. And this is the random module. Let me attenuate it again. And I'm sorry if I'm speaking low. I did a live stream the other night. I've been recovering from some sickness. My throat's a little meh. But I'm trying to speak clearly, I hope, at least. So this is the random module. And we're hearing more of those low, for want of a better word, fart sounds. You get really low oscillator sounds. They sound kind of like raspberries being blown, and more of the highs in this patch. So that's why I'm going to use the random module, and why I prefer the random module over the random LFO shape. And it may be a little bit more convoluted because you have to find a clock source for it. The random LFO can be run without a clock source of any kind. You can just set its rate. But I think that the advantages in terms of true random distribution in many cases are worth that extra layer of complexity. So, we're listening to our random module, and we go, okay, well, geez, Chris, you're still a long way away from something that I would call music here. Sure, it's good for sound effects and that sort of thing. But, how do we make this a bit more musical? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some other modules that I like to pair. I'm just going to move this oscillator down out of the way, that I like to pair with the random module. The first is a quantizer. What a quantizer will do is take a CV source, and it can be any CV source. It could be an LFO, it could be an envelope, it could be a random value generation, and it will quantize the CV that it receives at its input to the nearest note value. So again, let's just look at this when it's unattenuated, right? It's spitting out these note values, and these note values aren't telling you what the input is closest to. What it's doing is it's forcing that input into one of these quantized outputs. It's figuring out which is nearest and then producing that note at the output. So again, if we attenuate our input and connect that the output of our quantizer to the input of our oscillator. We're starting to get on the right track. We're getting things that we more easily recognize as sequences of notes. Now, the thing that I will say before I go any further with the quantizer is that there is a lot of room in generative music for music that does not occupy the diatonic scale, the traditional Western note values. There's room for microtonalities, right? This is one of the great freeing elements of generative music, is that in that attempt to approximate the unpredictable and organic in life, which I think a lot of generative music tries to do. It tries to feel like it's alive, right? Feel like it's unpredictable in the way that we appreciate most about life. In doing that, you can throw out a bunch of rules. So I am going to continue to work with a quantizer going forward, but there is absolutely no reason that you should or should feel the need to. There are a lot of other ways to generate tonalities. So I'm just throwing that out there. But I think, I often work with a quantizer, not always. I think a lot of people like to work with quantizers and produce things that they can, for instance, play against with an instrument that is tied necessarily to the diatonic scale, like a guitar or a piano or something like that. The caveat aside, there are a couple of ways that I like to connect my random module to my quantizer that help me dial in a range very quickly. So the first thing I'm going to do is send the output of my quantizer, or of my random module, into a multiplier. And I'm doing this because the multiplier is our way of attenuating signals, other than, connecting each end and doing that. So we can attenuate our signal by other means. And this is particularly useful in this instance, because we're going to set up two value modules, and I'm going to quickly rename them low and high, and I'm going to use those to set the low and high range of the random module's output. Let's see if I can remember how to spell. So the way that I'm going to do that is the first value module, low, I'm going to connect directly to the quantizer. And when I adjust this, that's going to set a minimum for the quantizer. All of the CV, if we remember that CV adds and inputs, all of the CV that goes into the quantizer will begin with this value as the baseline. I'm going to connect the high to this input of the multiplier, and we can use this to control the range. But here's where it gets really fun, right? If I set this, it's setting a range that isn't related to this low value, right? It's setting a range. I'm going to turn this back to A5. A5 would be 5 octaves, and when I added that to the quantizer right now, the range would actually be from A2 to A7, because we have this low note that everything would be added to. So right now it's attenuating the output of the multiplier by 5 octaves, but this high value doesn't actually refer to the high value of everything that's going into the quantizer. But we can add that. This is one of those things that you're going to go, if you haven't thought of it already, and I'm sure plenty of you have, well, that's pretty obvious. What we can do is we can take this low note, which is going into every, action of the quantizer, and we can put it through a CV invert and then connect it to the same input of the multiplier as our high value goes into. And what that's going to do is subtract that low value from the high range. So before, where this was 5 octaves and would have been a range from A2 to A7, and 5 octaves would be represented by a value of 0.5, we now have 0.3. And so we can adjust our low value and we'll get a higher range for the output of our multiplier. We can adjust our high value, but these will always define the highest and lowest values that will go into the multiplier. So I'm going to put them back at A5 and A2 because I think that's a pretty good range. And then I'm going to connect the output of the multiplier to the input of the quantizer. So again, the input of the quantizer is connected to 2 sources. Our low note, which will set a minimum, and then our multiplier, which will attenuate the output of the random module based on the setting for our low note and high note. Now let's have a listen again. And I think maybe this is a little bit too shrill still, so I can and then I can go into the quantizer if I want, and by default the quantizer will quantize to chromatic notes, right? The notes on the piano scale. But I can set a scale and I can set a key, and then it will take the input. Let's go with C sharp harmonic minor. And we start having something that sounds a lot more musical. But we're still, I think, a ways away from, let's say we've got bleeps down pretty good. We don't have bloops yet. And for that, I'm going to talk about how probability factors into this. Because right now, all that we're doing is there's no probability. Every time this clock cycles, a new random value is generated. It happens 100% of the time. Probability will allow us to add a sense of tension and release, these classic musical elements. But it'll do them randomly, so it may not be, Beethoven. Anyhow, I'm going to pause the video for now and set up a couple of things, and then we'll come back to this. And we're back to talk about probability, which is the other part of this equation. And I'll come back to this writing momentarily. What I have set up here on the second page is this probability gate. We might hear it referred to as a Bernoulli gate. And what it does essentially is it determines how often a probable outcome, a random outcome, results in 0 or 1, where 0 means no and 1 means yes. So I began by talking about how probability can tell us when an event occurs or not. And the way that we set this up in ZOIA, I'm sure there are probably some other ways, but the way that I set it up in ZOIA is with a comparator. Now, a comparator produces either 0 or 1, or you can go in the settings and it can produce -1 or 1, and that may be useful too in some probabilistic outcomes where you want, I don't know, an LFO to switch from, an upward swing to a downward swing. You could have that determined by a probability gate where the comparator was set to -1 to 1, but the default is 0 to 1. So it will take two values and compare them, hence the name comparator. And the way that we produce a probability gate in ZOIA is with a random module, and again, this random module is still tied to our clock, and a value module. Or you can directly bias the comparator's input, and you bias the positive input, or with the value module bias it. I'm going to switch over to notes because that works as sort of a course tune. And let's say we have the comparator set to 0.5. That means 50% of the time the output of the comparator is going to be 0 or it's going to be 1. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be 50% of the time every time, right? There are going to be runs where this random number is higher than 0.5, and that will produce zeros, no. And there are going to be runs where it's lower than 0.5, which will produce 1. So we can already use this to create a bit more variety in our randomness. So I've disconnected the clock from the random module, and now I'm going to connect it to the output of this probability gate. And we hear the notes begin to change less frequently. Now, the example there is not the best, but we're going to start doing some things to add to our voice too, and its complexity. I'm going to keep everything pretty simple for these examples with just an oscillator and a VCA. But obviously you could add filtering, and you can add random elements to filtering or other forms of modulation that work against these random changes, like smoothly changing LFOs that are on, say, a different clock than the probability outcome, so that the filtering is different and not in time with the changes in probability, which can create some interesting juxtapositions in texture. So I'm going to disconnect the oscillator directly from our little output circuit. We're quiet now. I'm going to connect this VCA in. And the next thing that I'm going to do is add a multiplier. I'm going to put the output of our probability gate in this multiplier, and at the other end I'm going to put our clock source, our LFO. And now what happens is when the comparator goes high and the note value changes, we're getting an output at our clock. Now, this sounds a little abrasive, so I'm going to add an ADSR. And by combining our clock source with the output of our probability gate, we can tie this probability gate back into a per cycle arrangement. So basically, you can have it decide irregularly whether it's high or low. It's not irregular, but not per clock cycle. But if you tie it back into the clock via a multiplier, you can decide yes or no. Is this on or off? And there are several different ways that you can use these. So I'm going to keep this connected to, I'm going to connect the per step output to the random module. So every time there's a step, it will determine yes or no whether or not it will change values. And it'll change values more quickly. Then I'm going to do something that's not extraordinarily musical and have this use the comparators output, which, as we recall, is less regular. But here we can get little runs of changes in value that are cut off by the ADSR. So there are a lot of different ways to approach this. We could run our ADSR just from the clock itself, so that it produced a note every time, but didn't necessarily produce a change in pitch. And you can see here, this is where the complexity starts spiraling out. So I'll do something now where I add another random element. I'm going to set the attack to 0. And then I'm going to add yet another random module. I want to attenuate this some so we hear some different amounts of attack. So each step, the attack, or each cycle of our clock, the attack of the ADSR changes. And so there are, like I said, a ton of different ways that you can use random modules. I'm gonna just add in another one. Remember, I left this swing amount open, or added it, and I'm just gonna throw in a random module that adjusts the swing per step. And I used a -1 to 1 because I want the duty cycle of the LFO sometimes to be long and sometimes to be short. And what this will do is, because the clock is being used to drive the ADSR, it will affect the gate length, because the gate of the ADSR is determined by how long the LFO is high. So it'll be, it'll be 50-50 occasionally, but it'll sometimes be shorter and sometimes it'll be longer. And I'm going to attenuate this a fair amount because I don't want it to fluctuate too much. But a little bit of variety will make things interesting. And we can keep adding layers of complexity. If you remember, I set the clock source to a linear LFO, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to use a value module to control that clock source, that LFO. But first, what I'm going to do is send that into a CV in switch in a couple of different patterns. So when I connect it at 100%, the LFO will cycle 100%. At 50%, it will be half or twice as long as the value specified. I'm going to set it to 200%, which will be twice as long, and then 400%. And that will be four times as quick. So we have here a switch that will choose between whole note or quarter notes, half notes, eighth notes, and 16th notes. And of course, we will control this with yet another random module. So I'm going to set the LFO's speed to 0 and connect its rate control to the output of this switch. And then I'm going to use this value module to set a base rate and use this switch to select between it. I think maybe we need to attack randomization because it's not appropriate for some of these faster speeds. So the idea here is that you can keep adding layers of complexity with randomness. You know, another way to do that would be to use this comparator to maybe make the random changes less regular in speed. So we start to get things that sound more interesting, and I would argue a bit more musical when we add a probability element to them. I'm going to add another one. And again, you can just keep adding layers to this. I had an idea when I was thinking about how to set up this patch. Actually, I'm going to tie this not to the clock, but again to the output of our probability gate. And, you know, that's one of the ways you want to think about these things. Do I want this to occur on every step or every time something else cycles? Do I want another layer of probability to determine whether or not a subsequent thing occurs? And for this, I'm going to have another LFO controlled by that same switch, but I want a triangle. I need another comparator for my probability gate. So we've got our random module again going into the negative output, and I'm not going to add a value module this time. I'm just going to bias it because I want a pretty low value here. What I'm going to set up, as I said, I need to set this LFO to be controlled by the same switch that's controlling the rate of our clock. So let me do that. What I'm going to do here is use a steps module to create a sort of mini arpeggiator. So what I want to do is just have this set to about 20%. And by setting it to 20%, I'll produce values between 0 and 0.1 or 0.2, which will be about 2 octaves. We look at, sorry, I don't want to attenuate it here. I want the full range of the steps module because it quantizes again. And this is something that I should have talked about earlier. It really matters when you're dealing with a quantizer, and the steps is another type of quantizer, a CV quantizer, but it's not one that is tied to notes. It really matters where you where there are a lot of instances where it doesn't really matter where you attenuate. In a line of CV, you can attenuate between the first and second module, or the first or the fourth and fifth. and it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But with quantization, it does. That's why we're quantizing at the input of our quantizer, because we only want certain notes to be outputted. But we don't want to attenuate the output of our quantizer, because those notes are now in a set relationship of CV. So when you start quantizing, you change the ratio there, and you stop getting note outputs. Here, because I want the full range of the steps module, and what the steps module does, it's going pretty fast right now, is it quantizes, let me just slow this down a bit. It quantizes the output of the CV that's put into it into a certain number of steps. So this is how you would get like stair step pattern LFOs and that sort of thing. We're going to use it here to create an LFO, and basically, an arpeggiator. What we're going to do is we're going to add it to the input of our quantizer. And this is where we would attenuate, or we could attenuate where the output of the probability gate is joined to the steps module at the multiplier. We want the full range of the steps module, so we want to attenuate after CV goes into it. And so the idea here is that every so often, and I've set this to, about 10%, right? The positive value will determine the percentage of the probability gate. The probability, the likelihood, the percentage that it goes high. About 10% of the time, this probability gate will go high, and the stepped triangle LFO will be sent to the input of the quantizer, and it will, during that step, produce a series of notes, like a little arpeggio. So let's see if I didn't test this out. We're going freestyle here. That sounds really cool, if you ask me. Oh, that just makes me giggle. So again, the whole idea here is that you can keep adding layers of probability, layers of chance, things that mess with the time, things that mess with the pitch, and, create some really exciting textures that are hard to predict, right? Part of the reason why that little arpeggio made me giggle is because I really didn't expect it to sound quite like that. It's sort of like a Game Boy shows up every so often in this little patch. And so that's sort of the fun, I think, of generative patches too, right? Is that you can set these conditions, and even sometimes when you know exactly what you're doing, I knew what I was doing, you still get results that surprise you, and you can adjust those conditions, I'm going to keep that at 10%, even though everything in my body tells me I love that noise and I need more of it, because by setting it so low, when it does occur, that little arpeggio, that little it's exciting, right? It's refreshing. And so, the advantage there is that, if I wanted to, I could set it higher or lower. I could change, the chance here that the note changes and our probability gate goes high. And by connecting these things in different ways, I began by connecting the output of this probability gate to the input of this new secondary probability gate. So only when the note changed would there be an arpeggiator. But now I can go back and connect it to the clock, and I'll get a slightly different result. So, again, the fun of this, I think the excitement of this, the way that you discover these generative patches that make you giggle or begin to really sort of take form as something that is your own, is by adding, more and more layers of complexity and thinking about the ways that they interact with one another, or not thinking about it and just trying new stuff and seeing what happens. But you can keep building off this basic idea that there's a randomness that guides the patch, but you can control how that randomness shapes what comes out the other end. So I will upload this patch to patch storage. I'm not going to clean it up. It'll be how you see it in this video, which is pretty raw. And, for me, this would be a starting point, not an end point. For a lot of other patches, I'd start adding effects, and maybe I'd add another synth voice. Maybe that synth voice would, be mixed with the other one randomly, or maybe it would be on an entirely different clock. You start thinking of these different ways in which you can create these playful, interactive environments. There'd certainly be some filtering. It needs some filtering. I may add that. But, the idea here is that with just these sort of two elements, with probability, the chance that something happens, and then the ability to determine or to create random outcomes, you can have these really sort of evolving and unpredictable sounds. So I hope for anyone who's been curious about getting into this sort of generative music in ZOIA, this was helpful. I know it's a long video. I haven't looked at how long at this point, but I'm guessing it's long. So, if you've stuck through it, thank you. But the idea here is that, you can just keep building. You can keep adding layers. You can keep playing around with things. So that's bleeps and bloops. And I'm sure I'll return to this topic at some point in the future to talk about other ways to generate music. And like I said, this is one specific type of generative music. There are a lot of other ones. So thank you for watching and listening. And hopefully the arpeggios make you giggle too.